Welcome to the Optimism Cafe. These are the edited highlights of a conversation between Vicwater's Peter Morison and the Centre for Optimism's Robert Masters, our chairman, Jeff Kerr-Bell, and yours truly, Victor Perton. We hope you enjoy this wonderful conversation as much as we did.
Peter Morison, what makes you optimistic?
What makes me optimistic? I think that we have a very connected group of people, no matter what circumstances we face. And we do fundamentally want to make a difference that's for the good of this world. And so I'm optimistic about that. But also with changes, of course, we're experiencing more extreme events, as we've recently seen. And so that obviously presents new challenges to our sector. But because of what I said earlier, we're not really looking just at what you would have done 30, 40 years ago, building new dams, for example. There are very few opportunities left in Victoria to do that. We've got past that. We're now looking at what are the opportunities to take those older forms of water and reuse them or use them in very effective ways. And so there's a lot of strategy around that now. And there's some good numbers that are being bounced around, levelised costs around those alternative water sources, which are actually proving up that we don't necessarily have to build dams to get cost-effective measures in place, which is really quite exciting. And knowing that those alternatives are going to bring about, I would say, oases across the nation, because we can use water in different ways to create new environments that, in a sense, are like meadow landscapes where you can, in these drier areas, provide quite effectively some nice areas of green or some nice areas of cooling, which the community will rely on. And we're seeing some of those examples. There's been some examples in South Australia around that. We've got some examples in Victoria in terms of providing irrigation cooling as an example, which you take those together and the future's really bright for where we are. And with the Millennium Drought, while that proposed a number of challenges for our sector, it also provided a number of key learnings that meant that a number of people from California and other parts of the world have visited Australia and swapped ideas. We've been interchanging with Israel, for example, on how we deal with dry incontinence. And there's just so much innovation there for us to share. So I feel strongly optimistic that there won't be any problems for us, as our sector is new to those, it is open to those new ideas. And it's really interested in driving that change.
That is extremely good to hear. I mean, that message isn't out in the broader community. And one of the things I want to ask in relation to that is, where does personal behaviour as far as water is concerned fit into the equation?
It's a big part, Robert. I have a responsibility, but I also think it's also something that you can have as a lifestyle. So while responsibility is a strong word, I think if you think of it as a lifestyle, it actually you just embed it into the way you do things each day. And that just means, the simplest of things can make a huge difference. Outdoor water use, for example, has been in the past a big part of our culture. And there's been some really interesting environmental history work done by the likes of Graham Davidson at Monash University in the past and others, where they've highlighted that we have these artifacts, if you like, that have caused spikes in our water use. You know, for example, the 80s was a time where we built lots of above ground swimming pools, the Clark Rubber swimming pool, for example, and that spiked water use quite tremendously as it did post-war with the advent of the washing machine. You know, you didn't have your washing day anymore. You could wash every day of the week, and while that has brought some comfort and convenience, as Elizabeth showed, we'll talk about into our lifestyles, we've now had to adapt our lifestyles to actually reduce the amount of water we use. And so we're now seeing a quotient of outdoor water use reducing as people have in many cases changed the landscapes that they're using. You know, they're using more indigenous species, which obviously has some benefits for wildlife, and so they're not watering as much. They're also living in smaller, having smaller footprints in their community, which means they're not using as much water. But then there's also the stuff in the home. We've had a huge amount of involvement as an industry in bringing technologies into the home, which are using less water. You know, Australia were pioneers with water efficient toilets, for example. All that stuff has just meant it's so much easier to save water. Yes, we have a responsibility, but it's clearly just part of our lifestyle, part of our footprint now, which is great.
What about the Murray-Darling Basin? That's always a topic of conversation. Where does that fit in to the future?
Well, it's such a big part of Australia. It has to factor into the future of our nation. It's a massive food bowl for Australia. It's the livelihood of a number of Australians. We're seeing in the Murray-Darling, yes, of course there are politics, but we're seeing things change in many ways, in the way crops are irrigated. So in the way water is used across the landscape, that is changing. We've seen dramatic improvements in irrigation efficiencies in many parts of the Murray-Darling Basin. And while there have been, of course, some really sad stories with, of course, the fish kills up the Darling and a number of those things, we're also seeing the growth of communities that are relying on each other to the extent that there's a real social connectedness, there's a real social fabric that is building resilience. And there are a lot of new enterprises coming out of the Murray-Darling because they've been challenged by denuded landscapes, by drought that's caused a lot of water limitations. And so they've, in a sense, been challenged to innovate and find new ways. And there's clearly a resilience that's been built into the Murray-Darling. And so I think that we've got a pretty good future. It may not seem that way when you listen to the media, but I think there's a pretty good future for the Murray-Darling. Australians will grow with it. And because we're listening a lot more to our traditional owners, that's also making a massive difference to the way we're going to govern and to manage our water systems. And I think there's a lot to look forward to there.
It's good to hear that there's a lot more good news than bad news out there as far as the water is concerned. So that's very, very pleasing to hear.
Jeff's been able to join us, and Jeff's a whiz on innovation. So I know you had some questions to ask Peter about innovation in the Victorian water sector, and in fact, Vicwater's own innovations.
Yes, Peter. One of the curious things about water, having in a previous life had Southeast Water as a client, is this wonderful balance between making money, returns to the government, the benefits that are generated back end, versus telling people to stop making you money by using less water. So I suppose, in terms of that innovation, how has the strategic considerations of the environment as they've emerged more strongly of the, I suppose, the broader considerations of while animals can't be optimistic about what is happening in terms of water for them, in terms of the ecosystems, how have you incorporated, I suppose, innovation in adapting not only water for human consumption or human use? Clearly, you're doing it in terms of some of the consumption, but in terms of human use, but also for the contributions for the broader community, including the environment.
Fantastic question, Jeff. Good to meet you. I think there's a number of things that I can say here. Firstly, in Victoria, we have, I think we're blessed with a really good understanding and growth of knowledge around our environmental water. And in many parts of the state, we're talking about allocations up to nearly 50% going to the environment because it's needed. And in many of those cases, it's to do with the Murray-Darling Basin. So that water is, in that case, providing the lifeblood of the rivers and waterways of our state. And so that the habitats, the biota in those systems then thrives as a result of that. So that's one factor. But another factor that's exciting, you mentioned Southeast Water, they're a really good example of innovation where they've put together through their business IOTA some fantastic off-the-shelf products that you can use to provide alternative water services in the home. And so linked to that is Aqua Revo project in Lyndhurst in the southeast, where that's part of a development project which is showing, not only is it demonstrating and providing an experimental platform for Southeastern IOTA to be able to test their products, but because the products are getting into, they're well developed now, we're also seeing the opportunity for people to live in those places and to enjoy that. Now, they can enjoy it knowing that they're using various sources of water sustainably. They're using real-time data to be able to help adjust their behaviours and tell them how their behaviours are working. And they can live in many respects without any guilt. They can enjoy living normal lives as we know them in our society without having much of a footprint. That's another really good example. There's also the circular economy part of this, that our water industry, I don't think many people realise, but the water industry actually has a huge contribution to the circular economy. I'm talking about the connectedness of a number of environmental media. And so when we're talking about water, we can link it to waste, we can link it to energy, and there are clear nexuses that our industry is doing. Now, I know Victor's part of Yarra Valley Water, being a director on that board, and they've got this fantastic waste to energy processing plant at the moment, which is showing a lot of promise for our sector. We've got a number of water corporations, part of an alliance that's working on a power purchasing agreement with renewables, a large-scale renewable project. We've also got so many small-scale projects like mini hydro plants. As you probably know, it takes a fair bit of energy to push water around this state, and they want to offset it in such ways that when it's running downhill, you can actually use the energy that produces, capture that, and of course use it for our homes and for businesses and the like. We have so many relationships to ecosystems in the way we operate our systems. It's fantastic, and I would say, monopoly often is a word that's taken negatively. I think that monopolies, in terms of our water industry, I think they're really important for our state. They're government owned. Any profits, as they may be called, that go back to the state are then used for hospitals, services. So effectively, if people are saving water and they're not paying so much for water, that's okay. Any people who are paying a lot more for water and some of that generates profits, it just goes back into services for those who need them. So it's a great cycle as far as I'm concerned.
Fantastic. I think one of the other questions, and you alluded to there, and might be talking about innovation now and next, was the concept of data and real-time data. And certainly some of the people I've met in the farming industry blew me away about the level of innovation that are happening in all sorts of agriculture and farming in terms of sensors and Internet of Things and tracking of data. What do you do? And then, of course, the other buzzword at the moment is AI and machine learning and so on. So I suppose what technologies or what innovations are you employing in terms of those sensors that help you manage it? I imagine you've got a lot like that. And then what is perhaps on the horizon in terms of the innovations that you're thinking about that will help continue to improve the way you serve, I suppose, us?
Yeah, so there's some really good technologies now. So I think every part of our water sector is involved in smart metering in some form. That's one example where, you know, I was talking to Mark Williams at Grampians Wimmera Mallee Water Corporation a little while ago. They've deployed a number of remote metering systems for their rural customers where, you know, they had a customer who was in, I think, Queensland on a holiday, and the water use had spiked on their property. The only reason they knew that the water use had spiked on their property is because the app on their phone told them. GWM Water had been in touch with them and said, there's something not working here. It just looks like you're using a lot more water, because they were able to track it. It turned out there was a major leak on their property, which they could rectify straight away. That's also happened in urban scenarios as well, where we've had a number of leak detection systems in place thanks to smart metering. We're also seeing it in probably not the most exciting for some people, but the wastewater sphere, where, you know, we actually need to have those detection systems in place to avoid major catastrophes. And we've saved the community, you know, millions, billions of dollars just by having sensors in place. That means we can prevent major outbursts and leaks and those sorts of things occur in our communities, because, you know, sewer mains can be incredibly large. You can drive cars through some of them. So when they burst, they're not particularly pretty. And so these sorts of systems actually have helped us to prevent those sorts of things happening. There's some really good examples.
Back to the personal, if I can, you know, because you're in a leadership position of leaders, and we believe that the times call for realistic and infectiously optimistic leaders, and infectiously optimistic leaders to counter the fear of the infection. So in your life and your work, who have been the people who've inspired you, the optimistic leaders that you say, yep, I want to be like them, or I've learnt lessons from them?
Look, I've walked among a lot of really, really enthusiastic and optimistic people in my life, which I'm thankful for. You know, some of them in my family. I read a lot, and he's no longer alive, but this will reveal my faith, I'm sure. But I think C.S. Lewis is a great optimist. You know, I've read a lot of his work, and it's interesting that right now, while we're grappling with this coronavirus COVID-19 outbreak, you know, C.S. Lewis wrote about a time when the atomic bomb was a concern for many people across the world, and you know, I think he said something like, if we're all going to be destroyed by an atomic bomb, let that bomb, when it comes, find us doing sensible and human things. Praying, working, reading, listening to music, bathing the children, playing tennis, I like this one, chatting to our friends over a pint and a game of darts. not huddled together like frightened sheep and thinking about bombs. They may break our bodies, a microbe can do that, but they need not dominate our minds.
That is brilliant. That is brilliant. So, I mean, there's been a lot. I mean, when Rob's asked you the questions on strategy, you know, you referred so brilliantly to the part that optimism plays in that, and in Jeff's questions on innovation, you've done that. So you've talked about your faith, and we've actually published lots and lots of material on the way in which faith reinforces optimism. So what are those other ways that you reinforce your optimism? Is it prayer? Is it meditation? Is it exercise? Is it choosing the company of optimistic people? What are your secrets, Peter?
I choose a number of those things. I've got a great life partner who's incredibly optimistic. Yes, I do pray. I get up every morning and consider my position in the world, and I'm thankful for it. I go for walks. I love walking because it gives me perspective. And things also enter my mind that are generally lateral and positive when I'm out walking. And I meet people. I wouldn't know half the people in my community if I didn't go walking. So I love that. At the moment, that's a little challenging, as you'd imagine. But we're maintaining contact, just physical distance, that's all. So there's some of the things that really keep perspective and keep me optimistic.
There's some brilliant scientific material this year on the value of just smiling at strangers.
Yes.
When you walk, just smiling or saying good morning, and the way it lifts you and the way it lifts the other person is just astonishing. So, Rob, have you got any other questions you want to ask Peter?
No, I think Peter's covered all mine. I was just going to ask him though, does turning down the news fit into your optimistic outlook?
Absolutely. I was reading from a colleague a few weeks ago about, and some of these methods I think have been in place for some time. I did a PhD and I was with a colleague, Andre Taylor, who's become a leadership expert, and we were working together at the time on PhDs at Monash. And you know, back then I had to just really focus, and that part of that focus has been when you get up in the morning, you start by not engaging with the media, by starting with some activities that help you to really focus on what you're doing in this world and why you're here. For me, that's important, and I meditate on those things. The news, I need to be aware of it in my job. So yes, I do take in the current affairs, but I do it with only half an hour window, and I just shut off after that half an hour because there's business to be done that's far more important than engaging with the media. And right now, that routine is critical because you know, a lot of stuff's been thrown to the wind in a sense, but there's so many opportunities where we can learn a bit out of the media and then think, well, what can I do to actually make a difference? And you need to switch that off and think about that yourself and in an environment with others where you can make that difference. And so while it plays a role and has a place, I think its place needs to be meted very carefully in your life.
I think you've nailed it. The advice of some of the leading psychs, Steven Pinker at Harvard and others who've analysed the change in the news. So when I was young, the news was roughly 50-50 good, bad. Today, it's around 95% bad. So it just contaminates you. And one of my friends, Charlie Hogg, the meditation expert, says you can meditate all you like, but if you're sitting in a toxic swamp, you'll still absorb the poison. So I think you've nailed that, Peter. Jeff, any other questions from you to as we're winding up?
No, I think that I am pleased to hear about the innovation and the consideration of the broader impact on the environment. Water is one of those things that we get from the environment, and it's important we continue to get it without having to treat it quite as much as we have done in the past. So it's exciting to hear some of the new things that you're doing and the broader considerations. Thank you.
Peter, this has been such a rich conversation. I think we've got a lot out of it. Even that wonderful quote from C.S. Lewis. Is there anything we haven't asked you that we should have asked you that you want to wind up with?
I'll just wind up by saying we have that simple tagline, better together. I think it applies to much more than just the water industry. And I don't think there's a better time to be talking about it.
Yeah.
We really need to be better together. And, you know, the four of us are having fun, aren't we? You know, I've had a latte and, you know, there'll be a lot of e-coffee moments, but that's fine. It's exciting. And if we keep doing this, we will be better together. So,
well, will you join us again maybe in a couple of months or so as we're making our way through this, and we'll do another Centre for Optimism cafe, as they may still be closed in Melbourne.
Yeah.
Peter, thank you so much. Robert and Jeff, thank you. To our audience, both on Zoom and Facebook, thank you. And we'll be making a video of this so that those of you who weren't able to join us live and online will be able to get the benefit of Peter's wisdom, his rich thinking, and the fantastic job he's doing for water.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you'd like to enjoy the work of the Centre for Optimism more, visit our website at centreforoptimism.com. Please feel free to subscribe or join, and we welcome your participation. And maybe you'd in fact like to lead a cafe like this too.